amado, pra ver do alto a fila de soldados, quase todos pretos, dando porrada na nuca de malandros pretos, de ladrões mulatos e outros quase.
Hello and welcome to Explaining Brazil, a podcast by The Brazilian Report. My name is Gustavo Ribeiro, editor-in-chief of The Brazilian Report. In our 11th episode, we will talk about racial inequality in Brazil. And to discuss that, I'm joined by Ivan Siqueira, head of the University of São Paulo's Research Center of Studies about Afro-Brazilians. Ivan has a PhD in Linguistics and Literature. Thanks for being here, Professor.
Hi, Gustavo. It's a pleasure to be here.
Ivan, since the beginning of the 20th century, Brazil has bought into this crazy idea that we are a land of racial democracy and miscegenation. And the numbers don't add up. Blacks amount to almost 80% of the poor population, just 17% of the rich. They are 2/3 of the inmate population and are more affected by unemployment than any other racial group. And yet, Brazilians tend to overlook that. In 2013, anthropologist Lilia Schwarcz published a book about race relations, and she conducted a poll which revealed a very curious data. 97% of people said they weren't racist, but 98% said they know someone who is racist. How can you have a racist country without racists?
Well, this is the magic of our country in Brazil. It's always unbelievable that it's possible to see this in data, but this explains a lot of our history, and a lot of our history especially related to black people, because when we have the abolition in 1888, we never have a plan what to do about this kind of people. So we are living the consequence of that at that time. When we look to education numbers, for example, 40 years after the abolition, the blacks were exactly at the same time. So half of a century after the abolition, the black people in Brazil was exactly at the same time. So no education, I mean basic education, I do not mean higher education. This is like a plane, so it was something constructed. Imagine before construction. So the statistics in Brazil show that in Brazil, after abolition, we never thought in terms of how we're going to construct a country based in diversity, based in that everybody will have the opportunity to study, to construct our family, to have a plan to study, and to become yourself what you want. If you want to be an engineer, for example, if you want to be a medicine, if you want to be a musician, how can you do that without education? Without the basic structure, because if you're born in a poor family in Brazil, and poor family in Brazil is exactly how to be a black family, how can you dream about your future? Because if you don't have enough education to surpass your desire. So I don't talk much about numbers, because we know a lot about the statistics, but to me the most important is the narrative, the myth. We don't have a narrative built in Brazil that accomplish what we can do with all of other people that in Brazil have all along the time been back. We don't have a plan for them. So it's not a surprise to me and for people who study and live as a black people in Brazil to see these statistics, because we haven't heard, we haven't seen, we haven't lived in this kind of narrative all over the world since the abolition time. So the problem is that we need to construct another history, another myth, and because of this, we need to improve education, especially basic education, but at the same time, we need to improve opportunity to work. But when you see lawyer people in Brazil, the highest company in Brazil, less than 1% of them are black. So it's everywhere. It's not about one specific field. Everywhere, in every field of investigation, in every field of job, in entrepreneurship, you won't see black people in them.
It's interesting what you're mentioning, because Maria Marta, our producer, who is here, she wrote an article that we ran on May 13th, which is the anniversary of the abolition, showing that black people amount to less than 5% of CEOs and members of the board in Brazilian companies, and they are only the majority in two levels of the company hierarchy. Youth apprentice, which are used to do office work and to essentially be an office boy, and trainees. All the other ranks in Brazilian companies are dominated by white people.
It's like if you had built a plane, and we are very successful to accomplish this plane, because after 130 years after abolition, we're talking about this kind of situation. It's completely insane. In every field, we'll see the same situation or correlate situation. Even in higher education, for example, before affirmative action in Brazil, but even consider that we have affirmative action almost 15 years, the situation is quite the same.
I was going to ask you, because for the past 15 years, it started with the University of Brasilia, but federal public universities have installed racial quotas to reserve part of their student body to low income, to racial minorities. In your opinion, what are the results so far? Has it improved? How much has it improved this minority situation?
Yeah, improved a little, but we have to understand that we have less than 20% of youngers in university and college. Less than almost 17, 18, depends on your statistic. We did accomplish 20% of youngers. So it's a very, very small number of younger that it's able to go to university. But we have in high school, for example, 1 million people outside who give up in the first year of a high school, and 70%, almost 75% of them are black. So we have more than 2 million younger people outside school, no job, no education, nothing, waiting for a criminal position. We don't know, but they have no possibility to make things that we believe they should be doing, because they have no opportunity. So when we talk about affirmative action, we are talking about less than 4 or 5% of black people. So in 15 years, of course, it's better than nothing, but it is not enough. Because if we are doing, in this kind of measure, we're going to take something like 100 or 18 years in order to balance the situation. If we do the same, we took 80 years or 100, because of course the white people want to stop it and wait. So we never will balance the situation. But of course it was better than nothing. Before affirmative action, we had a worse situation when we compare the situation we have now. But it's not enough if we want to balance it, if we want to look for diversity, if we want to look for equality, and the other possibility to make our people dream with university and college and the things that university and college can make for them in their lives.
It's interesting you mentioned that people in privileged situations, they want a gradual, slow process of improvement. And it reminds me a lot of our abolition process, because it was a process that lasted for, give or take, 70 years. It started with prohibiting slave trade, and then every single law that was in the sense of abolition was more about not touching the privilege. It was more about benefiting slave owners than slaves. Yeah. At first, it was babies would be born free, but then the slave owner would have the right to have his services until he was 18 or 21, and then another law was when a slave got to his 60th birthday, he was set free. So essentially, when he was less productive, more vulnerable to disease, he would not find job because most of these slaves were illiterate.
Exactly.
Then he was free.
Yeah.
If this process would be carried on until the very last slave would be naturally set free, we would have had slaves until the 30s in Brazil.
Yeah, this is very interesting to understand our history, because exactly at the beginning of the 20th century, we start to ask what kind of nation we'd like to be. The abolition was in 1888, but 20, 30 years after, we start to ask what kind of nation we would like to be. And the black people weren't part of this story, of this imagination. So, along the 20th century, we have no law to make it possible to black people and family to accomplish the same thing, for example, that immigrants had. When we compare, for example, in São Paulo, for example, in 1930s, when Getúlio Vargas won that revolution, they established quotas for Brazilian, because almost the place for a job in the born industry in São Paulo were for Italian people. So he established quotas for Brazilian.
Yeah, it was a whitewashing policy, right?
Yeah, because
black immigration was forbidden, and they wanted white Europeans in Brazil.
Exactly. But at that time, it was necessary to establish quota for Brazilian people, but white people, not black people, to have opportunity to make a career in the born industry in São Paulo. And we have a lot of other examples in Brazil and other states. So we never saw in 20th century strong policies in order to construct another situation for black people in order to accomplish equality and to make balance between opportunities and things related to that. So when we talk about quota, for example, they started in 2003. So we're talking about our century. So it's so new when we talk about things to make anything for black people in Brazil. That's why we have this kind of situation. When we talk about, for example, violence, the black people, especially in the peripheral areas of our cities, in the major cities in Brazil, they're the perfect victim for violence. So when we talk about bad things, blacks are the first. When we talk about opportunity and good things, we are not the first online.
I would like to mention to you, there's a new telenovela at Globo, which is the leading TV channel in Brazil, and they have just premiered a new show which is set in Salvador. Salvador is the most African city outside of Africa, and yet out of the 44 actors who are in this telenovela, only 4 of them are black. What does that tell you about the space that black people have in our culture, in the way we imagine Brazil?
Well, one important thing is that on average, in terms of absolute numbers, São Paulo has more black than Salvador than Bahia. They have more percentile, more than 70%. But in São Paulo, in absolute numbers, we are a large community than Salvador. I guess this is part of this narrative, this myth. We don't see anything wrong in to establish a soap opera in a city where the majority of people are black and put no black in this fiction because, well, we don't care. So this is, again, this is a reflection about what we have inside. So what we have inside is a history of our country where black people is not understand or as part of this country, as part of people who made a lot of effort in order to build this country. If you other people, if you other communities, of course. But so that's why people, for example, the writer, the people who are engaging to build this soap opera, think it's okay. I will put it or not depends on my will. I don't care if you are see yourself or if you didn't see. I don't care. This is the problem because all the information, all the sense they had inside of them, for me, is exactly this kind of history. So we have to change this history to make people think. This is not a simple thinking. Oh, this is my job. I do what I want. It's just fiction. Has no connection with reality. Though this is not the point. This point is why are you doing that? Why? What do you mean when you put a family and colleagues and a lot of people living in a place that you know that is real, that has a social history, and you put completely different situation, completely different people, completely different contact? What do you mean by that? What do you want to teach people? Because we know that we live in a country where people do not read. People do not have opportunity to read, to go to a theater, to make a rich life in terms of culture. So, in general, for bad, I think people depend a lot on TV. We still depend a lot on TV. So TV has something related to education, or should be worry about education. So this is a bad education because many people will see this and will think, well, this is okay. And the worst, even if they think it, their unconscious will understand that it's okay. So it's okay if I do not put any black in a fiction, even if that fiction was established in a city where the blacks are majority of people.
One thing that strikes me and that I find interesting is that in Brazil, when you have census, race is self-determination. So it's you who tell the guy doing the survey if you're black, you're white, you're Asian. And I have the numbers here right in front of me. In 1940, 63% of Brazilians consider themselves as white. This has changed over the years. In 2010, the last census, 45% said they were white, and 54% said they were either black or mixed race, which is the largest number ever. What does that tell you? Like the fact that more people are seeing themselves as mixed race.
Well, this change for me is related to the period when we start to establish policies at the end of the last century. So we started in 2001, at the end of 1990s, we start to discuss more about what kind of country we are. After that, we start to see a little change between, in every statistic that IBGE was doing, we start to see the difference. So at this time, people start to ask, well, am I black or am I white? But before, 20 years, 10 years ago, people don't ask this kind of questions. Because everyone wants to be white, of course, because white is the color of success, is the color of opportunity, who opened the doors. Why you should want to be a black? Mm-hmm. To be at the end of the file, the first to receive the violence. So, but now we are changing because, of course, this is also, in my opinion, related to globalization. It's possible to see connection between that. But in Brazil, exactly, it's possible to ask why we didn't have this kind of movement in 70s, for example. After the 68 revolution, when people start to think, well, we're going to construct a new society where everybody will going to be treated equally. After Martin Luther King in 68 in the United States, for example, after Mandela in 1994. Why we didn't start it in Brazil? In my opinion, because we didn't have, first, media. We didn't have internet, we didn't have web to make this kind of information available for most of people, and we didn't have critical mass because we weren't at university. We weren't in higher education, we weren't in high position in order to make this kind of information available for other black people community. So we are talking about among few peoples. So we haven't the opportunity to make this kind of discussion more available to a large part of community, and of course, now we are seeing even the success of a policy in other countries. For example, in Latin America, if you see this kind of a discussion, for example, with native people, mm-hmm. It's possible to make connections between what we are living in Brazil relating to black people and what native people are trying to do in Latin America, for example.
Mm-hmm. Talking about how you see yourself, for me, one of the weirdest moments in my life, at one point I did an exchange program in the United States, and I had to fill a form for Social Security. And in Brazil, for me, it was clear that I was a white person, but then when I got the form and I saw all these boxes, I didn't know what to check, and I asked the woman in the booth, like, what should I check? She looked at me like I was kidding, like, you're Hispanic. But it's interesting to see how this is more of a social construction than rather than a clear-cut issue, because for me in Brazil, since I'm considered white, and like you said, people tend to see themselves as white as possible, and for me was a very weird moment at this point, especially because our relationship with Latin America is different. We're not that culturally close to them, so it's harder to identify yourself with that. One thing that I wanted to ask you is, Seu Jorge, the singer, doing the documentary about Cidade de Deus, the City of God, the movie, he said, well, LGBT agenda has advanced, women's agenda has advanced, but black agenda has not. Do you agree with that statement?
I guess it depends on what you mean by advancement. Because, for example, when we compare the number of black people in school, in high school, 30 years ago and now, of course they have improved. A little, but we improved. 1 is better than 0. For me, 1 is better than 0, but of course it's not enough. When we look, for example, in high school situation, when I started my grad, for example, and look now, I have no more than 2 or 3 colleagues, black as me, in my whole graduation. Now I see my students in university, I see many of them. So this is something important to establish. When I look, for example, sometimes I go to Brasilia and I see black people in some positions. Of course, it's few positions, but 20 years ago, there's no black in this kind of position. Mm-hmm. We had a minister, a black woman in Brazil, in the government of Dilma Rousseff, for example. We never had this kind of possibility for a black woman in Brazil. So, in my opinion, we improved a little. But the question is, why we feel that if we hadn't improved? Because the distance is so large. But again, 1 is better than 0. So when I look, for example, to my grandparents, the situation, my grandma, for example, has no opportunity, never went to school. Mm-hmm. Died with 63 years old. Never. He was born in 1917, the Russian Revolution. So, how many black people today may see this kind of a sentence? I never stopped at a school. Fortunately, the minority of them. So we have improved, but the problem is that the distance is so large. Then we have the sensation that we never going to accomplish this kind of a balance that we're looking for. But I'm optimistic in this way because when I see the numbers, when I see the situation, and especially when I see the feeling that people are building inside themselves, I see hopeful because for me, when I compare, for example, 20 years ago and now, we see the proud black people, especially the new generation, have to be black, for example. Of course, we had this kind of pride, but we have no opportunity to express. Now you can express, and you have the internet, the web. You have another very special tools in order to establish communication, including with black people outside Brazil. So I guess we have more opportunities and more possibility to communicate and to make things, and even to think that you have more opportunity than in fact that you have.
And in terms of political representation, because black people are still underrepresented in Congress or at the state level, and yet there are some initiatives that are starting to pop out. In Rio, there was this party, Frente Favela Brasil, which is self-proclaimed the first black political party in Brazil. They will not be in the 2018 election because the rules to join the party system are very strict. They couldn't make it in time. But their candidates will be within other parties. How do you see this movement, and how do you see these actions to claim spaces of power and representation for black people in Brazil?
I guess it's very important. In fact, we have a black party in São Paulo in 1930s, Frente Negra. So when Getúlio Vargas established his government, they stopped the activity at that time. But we have Frente Negra in 1930s, especially in São Paulo. They include influencing black people in the United States. Many black people in the United States came to Brazil at that time to know and to learn the strategy and how to make things in a country where you are the goal for violence. It is a metaphor. It's not exactly a metaphor. But I guess we will see the consequence and the fruit of this kind of attempts in 20 years. But I'm sure it's completely important that people start to make this kind of question. Okay, politicians are not good, but okay, if you feel yourself as good enough and you are delighted to make some things in order to help other people, why not? Mm-hmm. And if you believe that you can help other people and if you want to work for your community, I think it's very important. But I guess we're going to wait for 10 or 20 years to see the consequence of that. But we have to make the first stop it. So we have to stop it in the first and then the second. So step by step, we're gonna make something different. But I guess more than that, we need to rebuild what we call politics. Because it's not only to put black people in this system. We have to change the system. It's not a system made in order to make the things that the Brazilian people would like and the Brazilian people need.
And do you see in the candidates that will run this year for president or for governors, I don't know, someone who is bringing that platform forward?
No, I didn't see yet any special name. I am just see overall the candidates for especially our Senate and our chamber. But in São Paulo we had 3 or 4 candidates in the last election, but they didn't get the position. But I think the most important is the seed. They are showing to other black people that it's possible. Even if you didn't get a position, the majority position, I think the most important is to show to the new generation that it's possible. You should dream and you should make things in order to accomplish what you wanted. It doesn't matter if you want to be a doctor, a professor, university, if you want to be a politician. If you want it, it's possible. Because I do it, so you can do it again.
Thank you very much, Professor. We're unfortunately out of time, but we could have stayed for hours talking about this. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
And a special thanks to our listeners. If you like the Brazilian Report, please check our website. It's Brazilian.report, or follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @BrazilianReport. That's all for this week. Thank you very much. See you next week.
São quase todos pretos, ou quase pretos, ou quase brancos, quase pretos, de tão pobres. E pobres são como podres, e todos sabem como se tratam os pretos.